Hi everyone, this is the first part of a two-part series in the anatomy of the Pterygopalatine fossa, or the PT fossa. This is an area that has been classically very difficult to spatially understand for dentistry students, so this was actually formed by one of your former classmates in 5186, Justin Lamont, who built this model with me to talk about the anatomy in a little bit more detail. Now, what we're going to go through today here is more about the relationships of the things that are coming into and out of the Pterygopalatine fossa. This is going to be sort of amalgamating the information that you've already received from the lectures, but also from the lab. So this model itself here can be used by yourself. I'm also going to walk you through it today. So if you do want to play around with the model yourself, the link is in the title of this video. So you can see it linked below there. So let's jump into it. We're looking at the skull here from the lateral side, and we're looking underneath the IT fossa here. And as we jump into the IT fossa, we'll notice that there's this space here outlined called the pterygomaxillary fissure. And the pterygomaxillary fissure is really the door into the PT fossa. So pressing this button up here, we can cast a balloon almost to show you the shape of the PT fossa. It's that space in here that's cast in this orange color here. Now this is in contrast to the IT fossa, which we see cast right here. So the IT fossa, as we've talked about in lab, is this space directly underneath where the temporalis muscle would be. It's the infratemporal fossa, and that's in contrast to the PT fossa, which has this space in yellow here, separated by that pterygomaxillary fissure. And again, I'll turn off the IT fossa so that you can see that space again. Okay, now jumping into some of the anatomy that we see there, I want to first sort of orient you to some of the bones that are related to this area. So in blue here, we're going to have the sphenoid bone, okay, which is bordering the PT fossa posteriorly. And then anterior to that, we've got the maxillary bone. So that's where those names coming from for the pterygomaxillary fissure. And then sort of deeper into the PT fossa, we have the palatine bone here that's forming sort of the medial wall of that space. In the IT fossa, we have our maxillary artery here, and our maxillary artery is going to give a branch called our sphenopalatine artery that branches in to sort of enter into the pterygopalatine fossa, and that's going to be our main artery that's providing blood to this space. You'll also note what's exiting out of this pterygomaxillary fissure is a branch of your V2 called your posterior superior alveolar nerve. Posterior because it's doing the posterior teeth of the superior alveolar processes. So the maxillary teeth is what it's supplying here. And you'll note that in the context of the IT fossa, which is right here, this is the only branch or only nerve in the IT fossa that you would see that's not a branch of V3. Okay, so none of the branches of V3 are shown on this label, but I do want to point out that this is one branch of V2, which is V2 is right here inside the PT fossa, that's going to be branching off and giving that supply to the posterior superior alveolar nerve, and just so happens that it actually exits out of that pterygomaxillary fissure to enter into the IT fossa for just a brief period of time before it dives into the actual maxillary bone to supply those upper teeth. All right, so with that sort of orientation and understanding of these nerves, I'm going to actually flip over to a guided version of this model so I can walk you through a few more views to get you oriented before you play around with the model yourself. So here we have the same lateral view, and I'm just going to remove the zygomatic bone so that we can have a view into that PT fossa a little bit more. So this is the same as what we saw before. We have the sphenopalatine artery branching off the maxillary artery to go into this space here, and inside that space we can see some of the branches of V2. We're just going to get a little bit closer in here. And we can start to appreciate inside the PT fossa the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is just sort of pulsing there in white when I clicked on it. So that's the pterygopalatine ganglion. And off of the pterygopalatine ganglion, which is branching itself from V2, maxillary division, we see some other nerves, such as the descending palatine nerves, which are going to be sort of the greater and the lesser palatine nerves. All right. And in addition to this, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to open up the PT fossa a little bit. So what we're doing here is we're taking the sphenoid bone posteriorly here, and we're kind of just opening it up like a book so that we can get into this space a little bit more. And when we do that, because this is such a cramped space, when we do that, we can really see all the connections coming into and out of the pterygopalatine fossa. So let's review all these nerves while we've got this view here. So first, we've got our maxillary division of trigeminal nerve, our V2. This is entering into this space, into the pterygopalatine fossa by the foramen rotundum, which is right there, foramen rotundum. Coming off of this, we have these sort of descending branches. They typically draw two, but in the anatomy lab, you'll kind of just see this as one sort of large connection here that actually joins up with the pterygopalatine ganglion itself. Now, the pterygopalatine ganglion is going to be the location where we see synapses happening for our parasympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. So these are going to be parasympathetic nerves that are coming in here, synapsing, and then following these nerves out to go to different areas of the oral mucosa and nasal mucosa to supply things like mucus secretions of the sorts. So in the back side here, we have another nerve called our nerve of the Vidian canal, or nerve of the pterygoid canal. This is the nerve that's bringing in our parasympathetic innervation to the pterygopalatine ganglion, where it's going to synapse and do its thing from there. This nerve, we'll see on the other side when we get to that part of the model. It's a branch of our greater petrosal nerve that's joining up with our deep petrosal nerve to bring a mixed autonomic nerve into the pterygopalatine ganglion. We also have, if we remove the palatine bone here, we can see a couple of other branches. We have the pharyngeal nerve here. This is, the label's not coming up, but that's going to be your nasopalatine nerve. And then we have our posterior superior and posterior inferior lateral nasal branches also coming off of these. Now we'll come back to these a little bit more where we might see these nerves on the other side. But ultimately why I pulled away this this palatine bone here was to show you how there's branches coming off the medial side of this pterygopalatine ganglion, and medial to the pterygopalatine ganglion is going to be the nasal cavity. So these are going to be branches that go into sort of the nasocavity versus and also the nasopharynx space to supply some sort of that sort of mucosa and general sensation to those spaces. So let's close that all up there, and we'll start traversing over to the front where we can see some of these other structures. So we'll put the zygomatic bone back in, and we'll rotate anteriorly here where we can look into the orbit. Now, before we get into the nasal cavity, which we see here, I just want to point out here that from the anterior view of the orbit, we can see our superior orbital fissure here and our inferior orbital fissure here. And I'll note that that inferior orbital fissure is actually an access point into the PT fossa from the top. So if you were the ganglion in that PT fossa and you looked up, you'd be looking up through the inferior orbital fissure into the orbit. And that's exactly actually how the V2, it just sort of traverses through this inferior orbital fissure to jump into this infraorbital canal, where it then comes out the infraorbital foramen to be the infraorbital nerve coming out below the eye. From this view, we can also see our nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity, we're only showing one side of it. So we see the lateral side of the nasal cavity right here, and we also see the septum right here. Let's rotate a little bit more and look at this in a bit different detail. So I'm going to make the vomer here translucent so that we can see into this nasal cavity. Now there's two nerves here. There's the nerves on the lateral side of the nasal cavity right here. And then there's nerves on the septal side of the nasal cavity right here. And the septal side is the nasopalatine nerves. The nasopalatine nerve is going to come from, let's turn the label off here, is going to come from the sphenopalatine foramen, cross across the top of the nasal cavity, and then descend along the septal side of the nose to provide sensation there, but also mucosal secretions, because remember, it's got that parasympathetic component to it coming from the PT ganglion. On the lateral side of the nose, we see other nerves here, and we'll see these again in a couple other views, but these are the posterior, superior, or inferior lateral nasal branches. These are going to do the sensation and mucosal secretions on the lateral side of the nasal cavity. So note that even though in sort of a view like this, we see nerves both inside the nose, we see sort of some ones here, but also this one here. But in 3 dimensions, we actually have one on the medial side, which is the septal part of the nose, and one on the lateral side, which is not the septal part of the nose. All right, so this is a big jump. What I did here is we pulled away the sphenoid bone. We completely translated it posteriorly to get it out of the way. And the reason why is we're just going to get into a bit of a different view here to look at how these nerves are coming into the actual nasal cavity. So again, let me click on this guy here. This is your posterior superior lateral nasal branch, and this is your posterior inferior lateral nasal branch. And you'll note how, whoops, there's the sphenoid bone in the way. You'll note how these nerves actually course from that Pterygopalatine fossa. They pierce through and completely cover the lateral side of the nasal cavity. Now, turning these branches off, we now have our nasopalatine. Whoops, clicked the wrong one. Our nasopalatine nerve right here. And our nasopalatine nerve, you'll notice, still comes from the PT ganglion that we see here, but now it's coursing through that sphenopalatine foramen to get into the nose, and then jumping across and going down the septal part of the nose. With the sphenoid bone removed, we can also see this branch here, which is the pharyngeal nerve. And the pharyngeal nerve is that one that was also coming medially off the PT ganglion. And it's sort of arching back and coming through a small little canal called the palatovaginal canal. And where it's headed here is if I zoom out here just a bit to show you some context, where it's going here is it's directing itself towards the nasopharynx. So the region of the pharynx behind the nasal cavity. So this pharyngeal nerve comes through that palatovaginal canal to enter and do sensation and mucosal secretion parasympathetic to the nasopharynx. Okay, remember this is sensation to the nasopharynx. This is not motor to the pharynx. Motor to the pharynx is going to be vagus for the most part, with 2 exceptions of glossopharyngeal for stylopharyngeus and tensor veli palatini for which would be done by V3. So that's a palatal muscle. All right. So now we're going to put sphenoid bone back in and we're going to make it translucent. So what are we looking at here? Let's zoom out to give some context. We're looking into the cranial cavity here. We're specifically looking into the middle cranial fossa. And in the middle cranial fossa, we see the trigeminal ganglion, which is giving its V1 branch here, its V2 branch here, and its V3 branch here. So this would be foramen ovale, where V3 is dropping out. and V1 going through the superior orbital fissure to go into the eye. So there's that superior orbital fissure right here. And those nerves are obviously cut off because this is a PT fossa focused model. So V1 and V3 really aren't important for the PT fossa. It's mainly V2, which we see going through foramen rotundum here. And we can see it where we picked it back up at the beginning of this walk through, where we see the V2 running through the PT fossa here with the ganglion below. Now, the purpose of this translucent view here is to bring your attention to this hole right here that's immediately medial to foramen ovale, and this is foramen lacerum right here. And why I bring this up is because foramen lacerum is where the nerve of the Vidian canal begins to form. Right there, that thing that I just flashed. Nerve of the Vidian canal, or nerve of the pterygoid canal. These are both the correct terms to be using here. The foramen lacerum is sort of a funny hole that nothing actually passes through. But what we see happening here is greater petrosal nerve, which is running along the base of the skull right here, will drop into the sort of upper part of foramen lacerum, and it will merge up with a branch of your carotid plexus called your deep petrosal nerve. Greater petrosal has sympathetic or parasympathetic fibers. Deep petrosal has sympathetic fibers. So when they merge together and form this nerve of the pterygoid canal, we have a mixed autonomic nerve, a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nerve together. And what we can see here is that that nerve of the pterygoid canal runs through the sphenoid bone, right? You see it running through the sphenoid bone here, and eventually dives into the PT fossa, and it goes directly into that ganglion. And as I mentioned before, this is the nerve that's bringing the autonomic information into that ganglion, and specifically the parasympathetic innervation that's going to synapse within that ganglion. The sympathetic innervation has already synapsed by this point. It's already synapsed in the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic chain. So these are post-ganglionic sympathetics at this point. But we have pre-ganglionic parasympathetics at this point, which are going to synapse to become post-ganglionic parasympathetics at the PT ganglion. All right, so let's swing back around front here and have a look again at that space. So we're now looking into the orbit, and we are looking at the V2 coming through here. And what I wanted to point out at this point was just showing you how that there's this branch of V2 above the PT fossa where we see the ganglion below. There's the ganglion in there. So there's a branch of the V2 called your zygomatic nerve right here. And your zygomatic nerve is a branch of your V2 that's giving a couple different branches. One is your zygomaticotemporal nerve here, and the other is our zygomaticofacial nerve. And we talked about those in one of the earlier labs, in the face lab, where we talked about sensation, V2 sensation out to sort of the upper zygomatic bone here. That's how these branches are getting here. Now, these are pretty small branches. We don't normally see them in the lab, but it's important to note that they are there. The other communication that we see happening here is the parasympathetic innervation that's going to our lacrimal gland. The parasympathetic to our lacrimal gland is done by this communicating branch from zygomatic nerve here all the way up to the lacrimal nerve. Okay. So keep in mind that this communicating branch does exist here to bring parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal gland. All right. And last but not least, I wanted to raise your attention to the palate. So the palate here, we see the soft palate, and the soft palate has innervation by both the greater and lesser palatine nerves, but also the nasopalatine nerve right here. And together, those three nerves provide innervation to the hard and soft palate. So lesser palatine nerve is going to do the soft palate, and greater palatine nerve right here and nasopalatine nerve are going to sort of connect with each other to cover sensation of the hard palate. Now, to remind yourself where these actually come from, well, there's nasopalatine nerve running along the septum, and then it runs through the incisive canal before dropping through to get to the palate. That's in contrast to the palatine nerves, which actually just descend out the base of the PT, fossa. And I'll just sort of expand the PT fossa again here, where we see that ganglion here with its nerves descending down. And if I were to rotate here slowly, boom, there we see these nerves coming out onto the palate, the lesser and greater palatine nerves coming out onto the palate. So those are taking a little bit more direct course, just descending down that PT fossa. All right, now flipping back over to the student model that you'll have access to. All of the things that I just walked you through today, you can have the sort of freedom to do yourself in this model. We've got, I'll just move my face out of the way here to show you that we've got another button down here. The model here has a couple of functions. So we can click on these things to cast the IT fossa to see if you want to see the potential space of the IT fossa. We can also cast the PT fossa in relation to that so that you can compare the two. In this model, when you're going through, if you ever want to click on this sort of white ring here, this will tell you what the opening is that's relevant to you. And you can also toggle those on or off like this. You can click on any of the nerves to give labels. And if you find that you've got too many labels on the go and I don't know, it's getting crazy, then you can always click, why isn't this one lighting up? Anyway, you can always click hide labels over at the side here and it'll clean up the image for you. If you want to contrast some of the bone, when you get in sort of zoomed in, sometimes it's hard to see what bone you're looking at. So you can color these bones accordingly here so that you can get in and really explore which bone's contributing to what. And we can see, openings to different things here. So please explore this now that you've got that sort of understanding of the model. And we've also got the translucent option here. So if you want to flip the sphenoid bone to be translucent and look through that, or the vomer, you can do that over there. Now, finally, if you're not using a mouse that's a little bit natural, there is sort of a controls thing here. You can sort of look at this on how to control on the mouse. I think this does work on mobile as well, but I'm not sure if you'd want to do this on a mobile app. It might be a bit too much all at once. But finally, the last thing that you might want to do is explode the skull a little bit, just so that you can see into the PT fossa. So if you're kind of looking at this view and you hit this button down at the bottom, it will open up the PT fossa. Now, I will acknowledge for you that this will give you a better view into all the branches. So now we can see, we can see the nerve of the Vidian canal. We can see the pharyngeal nerve going through the palato-vaginal canal, and we can see our nasopalatine and lateral and inferior, posterior lateral nasal branches, as well as our palatine branches that are greater and lesser palatine branches coming off the bottom. So you can see all these nerves here a little bit better when it's exploded, but just note that when it does do this, it moves the bone relative to the nerve. So sometimes the foramen won't be perfectly lined up. Just keep that in mind. But for the most part, they are pretty well kept in their space. Even in the exploded version here, you can still see that V2 comes through foramen rotundum and things like that. So it's great to get in a little bit more, but ultimately it does take things out of anatomical position. So just be aware of that when you're going through there. But you're welcome to work through that. And if you've got any questions for us, definitely reach out and let us know. Now, this is a work in progress. This is a model that we only created last year. It was the first year we had this. So if you do run into any bugs, you can also send that to us as well. Hope this helps. And in the next session, what we're going to do is we're going to take this to the next level, which is a very exciting project that we've been working on, where we're going to do a little bit of a virtual reality walkthrough of this skull here with YouTube 360. And you guys are going to follow along with me. So we're going to do a little bit of a magic school bus and walk through the skull and walk through the different foramen associated with the Pterygopalatine fossa. So stay tuned for that. We'll be posting that soon, I hope, pending tech issues.